Late autumn, 1963. New York after dark had a particular weight to it. Not just the cold in the air, but the sense that every word spoken under bright lights could ruin a man before midnight. The ballroom of the Midtown Hotel had been converted into something halfway between a press conference and a televised tribunal. Cameras stood shoulder to shoulder like silent jurors. Flashbulbs popped in irregular bursts, brief white wounds in the dimness. Reel-to-reel tape recorders hummed on long tables, already hungry for something worth replaying. Dean Martin stood at the podium not as a defendant, but not entirely as a guest either. His tuxedo fit perfectly, but there was no performance in him tonight. He hadn't come to sing, hadn't come to charm. He had come because not showing up would have looked worse. That was the unspoken rule of the era. Absence was interpreted as guilt, long before evidence ever mattered. The moderator had just finished thanking donors for their generosity when a voice cut through the room. Calm, practiced, sharpened by years of knowing exactly when to strike. The journalist didn't raise his hand. He didn't wait to be acknowledged. He leaned forward instead, microphone already close to his mouth, eyes fixed on Martin with a look that suggested the question had been rehearsed for weeks. "Mr. Martin," he said, the words measured, almost polite, "how do you explain your long-standing friendships with men the FBI openly calls organized crime figures?" The room inhaled as one body. Somewhere near the back, a glass clinked against another and immediately stopped. A nervous chuckle escaped from a woman near the aisle and died before it reached a second breath. The cameras moved closer, without being told to. A producer gestured silently for a tighter shot. This wasn't curiosity. This was accusation dressed in a clean suit. Dean didn't react. Not immediately. His hands remained folded loosely in front of him, fingers relaxed, as if he were listening to a compliment that required consideration. His face gave nothing away. No smile, no frown, not even surprise. Only stillness. And that stillness pressed harder on the room than any shouted denial could have. The journalist let the silence stretch, confident it would do his work for him. Silence suggested calculation. Calculation suggested guilt. That was the logic viewers at home had been trained to follow. Someone in the front row shifted in their chair. The moderator glanced sideways, unsure whether to intervene. He didn't. Everyone understood the value of letting this moment breathe. A flash went off directly in Dean's face. He didn't blink. The question wasn't asking for an answer. It was building a frame. Dean Martin on one side, the word Mafia on the other, and the audience invited to connect them. No documents were presented. No names were spoken. None were needed. In this climate, implication was enough. Careers had collapsed under far less. Dean finally lifted his eyes from the edge of the podium and looked out across the room. Not at the journalist alone, but at the cameras, the notebooks, the waiting mouths. For a fraction of a second, it seemed as though he might speak. And then he didn't. He let the pause deepen, stretch into discomfort. A pause that said nothing, yet accused everyone listening of wanting something ugly to be true. Somewhere off stage, a producer whispered, "We're still live." Dean Martin remained silent, motionless, while millions watched, and the weight of an era settled squarely on his shoulders. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The silence didn't end when the red light on the studio camera went dark. It followed Dean out of the ballroom, down the carpeted corridor that smelled of cold cigars and floor polish, and into the night where Manhattan traffic sounded suddenly distant, as if the city itself was listening for what would happen next. He slid into the back of a car without speaking. The driver kept his eyes forward. Nobody needed instructions. In this country, in this decade, a man's reputation could be dismantled faster than a cigarette could burn to ash. A few years earlier, the air had already been poisoned with the same suspicion. Only then, it lived mostly in headlines and hearing rooms. The late 50s had turned America into a nation obsessed with shadows. Senate investigations turned criminals into public celebrities and respectable men into nervous actors who pretended they'd never heard familiar names. Every household had seen the black and white footage. Stern lawmakers, microphones like weapons, witnesses sweating under bright lights. People learned the vocabulary of menace the way they learned the names of baseball teams. Organized crime became a phrase that meant everything and proved nothing. The country used it like a match. It didn't matter what it touched, it would leave a burn mark. In Washington, power was performed through denials. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI insisted for years that the Mafia, as a unified force, was exaggerated. Yet agents quietly collected files thick enough to crush careers. That contradiction wasn't a mistake. It was leverage. If the government admitted too much, it had to explain why it had done so little. If it admitted too little, it could keep its hands clean while the fear did the work. Everyone understood the game even when they pretended they didn't. And in the middle of that game sat entertainment, smiling under spotlights, while the country demanded purity from the people who existed to distract it. Las Vegas was the clearest example. A desert city polished into glamour, with money that didn't ask to be questioned. Casinos rose like temples, and behind their velvet ropes, the rules were different. A senator could be treated like royalty at one end of a room, while, at the other end, a man with no official title decided who got a table, who got a contract, who got left alone. Deals weren't signed with ink so much as with eye contact and a handshake that lingered half a second too long. Rat Pack nights made it all look effortless. Frank in command, Sammy sharp as a blade, Dean drifting through it like he belonged to nobody and everybody at once. Their laughter sounded free, but the world around them was anything but. In that era, a performer could share a drink with the wrong person and wake up to canceled bookings, worried phone calls, and a studio executive suddenly unable to return your messages. The public demanded clean heroes. The same public lined up to hear gossip about criminals. That was America's double standard. It wanted the thrill of danger without admitting it. Enjoyed the thrill. Newspapers mastered the art of insinuation. They didn't need to print accusations. A question mark could do the job. Under scrutiny? Ties? Connections? Editors knew exactly how to plant suspicion while keeping their hands technically spotless. It wasn't proof that destroyed you, it was the lingering stain of doubt. Dean understood this better than the men who chased him with microphones. He'd grown up learning how quickly a room could turn when someone decided you were useful as a target. He also understood something most people refused to say aloud. In show business, morality was often a costume, changed depending on who was watching. Politicians shook hands with men they publicly condemned. Executives accepted money they would never describe in daylight. Then, when they needed a scapegoat, they pointed at the singer. So when that question hit him on live television, it wasn't just about friends, it was about control. It was about choosing a famous face and forcing it to beg for forgiveness on cue. And if he refused to beg, they could punish him anyway. Because in this era, even innocence had to be performed correctly to be believed. By morning, the machinery was already in motion. Not loudly, not with sirens or court orders, but with the smooth efficiency of people who had done this many times before. Dean woke to a hotel phone ringing longer than it should have, the sound sharp against the quiet of early Manhattan. No one left a name when the call ended. Only a clipped sentence, delivered as if it were a courtesy. Just so you know, today will be complicated. The newspapers hit the streets before he finished his coffee. His name wasn't accused, it was framed. Headlines leaned on suggestion, not certainty, the kind of phrasing that allowed editors to deny intent while guaranteeing damage. Under federal attention. Questions raised after televised exchange. The articles quoted no new facts, only recycled the question that had already been asked on air, as if repetition alone might turn suspicion into truth. By mid-morning, the second pressure arrived, this one dressed as procedure. Studio offices received inquiries described as routine. Casinos were asked to confirm schedules, contracts, dates. No one said investigation. No one had to. The effect was immediate. Bookings were paused, not cancelled. Until things settle, managers explained in voices careful not to sound afraid. That was how reputations were strangled, slowly, politely, with plausible deniability. Dean's manager called from Los Angeles, speaking faster than usual, as if speed might outrun consequences. He relayed conversations without names attached. Network executives who admired Dean greatly. Sponsors who hoped for clarity. A charity board quietly postponing an appearance, not because of belief, but because of risk. No one accused him directly. Everyone wanted him to fix something that, officially, didn't exist. The third attempt came wrapped in concern. A private meeting in a borrowed office, blinds half closed, though there was nothing to hide. Two men who smiled too often leaned across a polished desk and spoke as if offering advice to a friend. All he had to do was make a clean statement. One sentence. Simple. Public. I have no involvement with organized crime. Say it once. Say it clearly. And the storm would pass. They said this like doctors promising relief, never mentioning the side effects. Dean listened without interruption. He heard what they weren't saying. A statement wouldn't end the story. It would anchor it. Denial would keep the question alive, give it something to push against. Worse, it would imply that someone else needed protecting. That names existed, he was refusing to say. Silence made him suspicious. Speaking would make him useful. Between meetings, the calls continued. Some were brief, almost apologetic. Others were colder, reminding him of clauses and obligations, of how fragile goodwill could be. A longtime booking agent canceled lunch without explanation. A producer who had known him for years suddenly preferred to communicate through assistants. The world didn't turn its back on him all at once. It stepped away, one cautious foot at a time. What made it unbearable was the civility of it all. No threats, no raised voices. Every pressure arrived with a smile, with phrases like, "For your own good," and "Everyone wants to help." Violence would have been easier to recognize. This was something else, a coordinated erosion, designed to make resistance feel unreasonable. By evening, the narrative had shifted without him. He was no longer a man being questioned. He was a problem to be managed. The expectation settled in the air. He would speak soon. He would clarify. He would cooperate. That was how the story usually ended. Dean stood at the window of his room, watching the city lights blink on one by one, and understood exactly what they were trying to do. They weren't asking him to tell the truth. They were asking him to play his assigned role in a story that no longer belonged to him. He stayed at the window until the glass turned into a faint mirror, and the city became a scatter of blurred diamonds. Somewhere below, horns flared and faded, impatient, ordinary. Up here, the air felt sealed, as if the room had been designed to keep sound out, and also to keep a man's thoughts from escaping. Dean didn't pace. He didn't throw anything. He didn't reach for the whiskey people expected to see in his hand, the prop the public had already written into his silhouette. Instead, he sat in the corner chair beside an unlit lamp, jacket still on, tie loosened a fraction. A cigarette rested between his fingers for a long time without being brought to his lips. When it finally did, he took one drag, then set it in the ashtray like he'd lost interest mid-sentence. The television across the room was off, but he could still hear it in his head. The tone of the question, the little lift at the end designed to sound reasonable while doing maximum harm. He'd been around long enough to recognize traps the way a singer recognizes a bad microphone. You might still use it, but you never trust it. His manager had tried again a few minutes earlier. Not the frantic voice from the morning, the calmer one. The voice people use when they're trying not to admit they're scared. Dean, just say one clean sentence. One. You don't owe anybody a speech. Just give them something. Dean's eyes hadn't moved from the dark window. His reply was quiet, almost tired, as if he were explaining something simple to a man who kept insisting on making it complicated. If I give them something, he said, they'll want the rest of it tomorrow. There was no anger in him, no need to win the conversation. He understood the deeper truth. The moment you start defending yourself in public, you've already accepted the court's authority. And this court wasn't a judge and jury. It was a crowd. Editors, sponsors, rivals, politicians, bored viewers hungry for a new villain. You didn't beat that court by arguing. You beat it by refusing to kneel. He knew what the statement would do. It would put his own mouth around the word they wanted attached to him. It would make organized crime and Dean Martin appear in the same sentence, cleanly typeset, replayed on radio, clipped into tomorrow's columns. Denial would become a permanent exhibit. And if he denied it once, they'd ask why he denied it at all. If he denied it twice, they'd ask what changed. Every no would sound like fear to someone looking for fear. The room held the smell of hotel linen and faint smoke. He could hear his own breathing, steady, unhurried. A man who'd lived through the business understood that panic was expensive. It made you trade away things you never got back. What weighed on him wasn't simply his own bookings. He had spent years watching people survive by keeping certain doors closed. Names stayed unspoken because speaking them didn't produce justice. It produced collateral damage. In this world, the truth wasn't a clean thing you laid on a table. It was a blade. You had to know who it would cut before you picked it up. Dean's strength was not that he felt no fear. It was that he refused to let fear write his lines. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and stared at the ashtray as if it might answer him. Then he stood, not with drama, but with decision. He turned on one lamp, a small pool of light in the corner, and in that simple gesture, there was a kind of message. He would not let other people's darkness dictate his posture. Outside, New York kept moving. Inside, Dean Martin stayed still, because he knew something the men chasing headlines didn't. In this game, the first person to over-explain is usually the one who loses. They expected him to break in the place they controlled, under studio lights, between commercial breaks, with a host ready to steer the story. When that didn't happen, the waiting turned meaner. A week of careful silence had made people bold. Boldness in New York always looked like another microphone shoved too close. The moment of change came at a fundraiser downtown, a smaller room than the hotel ballroom, less television polish, more old money. The kind of evening where the chandeliers were dimmed on purpose so faces didn't have to be fully seen. Waiters moved in practiced arcs, with trays of drinks that nobody seemed to finish. At the edge of the crowd, a cluster of reporters stood, as if they'd been invited by impatience rather than by name. Dean arrived late, not for effect, but because he refused to arrive early and let them arrange him. He shook hands, nodded to donors, spoke softly to a widow who thanked him for showing up. If there was tension in his shoulders, it didn't reach his face. He looked like a man who had accepted the weather and decided not to argue with it. Near the coat check, the same Hunter reporter appeared, or one close enough to share the same appetite. The man's suit was sharper than his smile. He waited until Dean was half-turned, until the small knot of people around him made retreat awkward. Then he asked it again, almost word for word. Loud enough for the tape machines, polite enough to claim professionalism. "Mr. Martin," he said, "for the record, will you deny any association with men the Bureau identifies as organized crime?" The word "deny" hung there like bait. For a heartbeat, Dean didn't move. Not because he was trapped, because he was choosing the exact angle of his reply. In the background, someone laughed too brightly at a joke that hadn't landed. A donor couple froze mid-sip. You could feel the room deciding whether it wanted scandal more than it wanted decorum. Dean turned slowly until he faced the microphones. His expression stayed level, almost mild, as if he were correcting a misunderstanding about the time of a dinner reservation. No heat, no show. The restraint was startling. People were so used to men defending themselves with volume. He spoke in short sentences, cleanly cut. "You want a denial," he said, voice low enough that the reporters had to lean in. "Because a denial makes your story simple." The reporter's eyebrows flicked, just once. Not triumph, surprise. Dean didn't give him space to recover. "If I say no," Dean continued, "you'll ask why I'm nervous. If I say yes, you'll celebrate a headline you couldn't earn with facts." A flash went off at the wrong moment, bleaching his face for a fraction of a second. When the light cleared, Dean's eyes were steady, fixed not on the reporter's mouth, but on his intent. Then he shifted the weight of the room with one quiet turn, the kind that doesn't sound like an attack until it's already landed. "So, here's what I'll put on the record," he said. "I'm responsible for what I do, not for who you decide to paint beside me." The reporter started to speak. Dean lifted a hand slightly, not in anger, but in control, a gentle stop sign. "And you," Dean added, still calm, "are responsible for what you suggest to millions when you don't have the courage to prove it." No names, no counter-accusations, no mention of the FBI beyond what had already been thrown at him. He didn't plead innocence. He didn't brag. He placed responsibility back where it belonged, on the person manufacturing suspicion for sport. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence was different now. Earlier, his quiet had felt like vulnerability. This quiet felt like a verdict. A woman near the wall exhaled, as if she'd been holding her breath the entire week. A man in a dark suit shifted his stance, suddenly uneasy about being seen too close to the reporter. One of the younger journalists glanced down at his notepad, as though the words he'd expected to write had vanished. The reporter tried again, something about public interest, about transparency. Dean's reply was almost gentle. "Then be transparent," he said. "Bring something real. Until then, don't ask me to do your work for you." He turned away, not dismissive, not theatrical, simply finished. And that was the shock. He hadn't won by shouting, or by charming, or by confessing. He'd won by refusing to accept the premise. As he walked back into the flow of the fundraiser, the microphones didn't follow with the same confidence. They hesitated, as if the ground had shifted under them, and they weren't sure where the safe footing was anymore. The first sign that something had changed was not applause or praise, but absence. By the next morning, the phones in the newsrooms rang without urgency. Editors stared at blank spaces where yesterday's outrage was supposed to continue and found nothing new to sharpen. Dean Martin's words from the fundraiser circulated, quoted and requoted, but stripped of heat. They refused to behave like a scandal. Without a denial, without a confession, the story had no pulse. Radio hosts repeated his lines cautiously, testing them in their mouths as if unsure whether they were allowed to sound impressed. One called it evasive, then moved on too quickly, sensing the label didn't stick. Another praised his composure and immediately softened the compliment, afraid of seeming aligned. The balance had shifted, not dramatically, not publicly, but enough to make everyone step differently. The journalist who had pressed him hardest discovered how quiet isolation could be. Invitations slowed. A panel appearance was postponed. A producer suggested diversifying topics for a while. None of it was framed as punishment. That was the industry's specialty. Consequences arrived disguised as scheduling conflicts. Inside studios and agency offices, conversations changed tone. Executives who had urged caution a week earlier now spoke of overreach and optics. Nobody apologized for doubting him. Instead, they rephrased the past, acting as if they had always known the attack would burn out. Memory in Hollywood was flexible when it needed to be. Support came in indirect forms. A respected producer mentioned Dean's name in a trade interview, praising men who understand restraint. A late-night host joked about reporters who confuse questions with evidence, earning laughter that carried an edge. Even a member of the Rat Pack, asked directly about the controversy, smiled and said only, "Dean knows when not to talk." The sentence did more work than a defense ever could. Behind the scenes, calls resumed. Not celebratory, practical. Bookings reopened with the same careful phrasing they had used to pause them. Dates are back on the table. We think the temperature has cooled. Casinos confirmed appearances without comment, as if nothing had happened at all. That was the real measure of power, when business continued without explanation. Dean himself didn't capitalize on the moment. He didn't grant interviews. He didn't reframe the story in his favor. He returned to work as though the noise had been weather passing through, not a storm he needed to reference. When asked offhand how he was holding up, he answered with a shrug and a half-smile, the kind that closed doors without slamming them. The most telling reaction came from those who said nothing. No follow-up questions from federal offices. No clarifying statements. Silence from places that understood the implications of pushing further. It wasn't approval. It was recognition. Pushing now would require substance, not insinuation. And substance was in short supply. In dressing rooms and private bars, people talked in lowered voices. Not about guilt or innocence, but about posture. About how rare it was to see someone refuse the ritual of public self-flagellation. Someone observed that Dean had made the story expensive to continue. Another said he'd reminded everyone that dignity, when held long enough, becomes inconvenient to attack. The pressure hadn't vanished. It had simply lost its grip, like a hand that realizes too late it's holding smoke. By the end of the week, the industry moved on, as it always did, toward something louder, easier to digest. But a subtle adjustment remained. A recalibration. Those who watched closely understood what had happened. The power hadn't shifted to Dean in a triumphant way. It had shifted away from those who believed they could force him to speak on their terms. And in that quiet rebalancing, his position hardened, not through declaration, but through endurance. Weeks passed, and the noise dissolved without ceremony. not with a headline declaring victory or an apology printed in small type, but with something far more definitive: disinterest. The story stopped earning space. Editors discovered it no longer pulled readers. Producers realized it no longer spiked ratings. Suspicion, once it fails to perform, is quietly retired. Dean Martin's name drifted back to where it had lived before the question ever reached him: on marquees, in radio playlists, in the easy cadence of late-night introductions. No one announced a resolution. None was required. The absence of a conclusion became the conclusion. He returned to the stage in Las Vegas on a warm evening when the desert air clung to skin even after sunset. The room was full, but not fevered. No tension hung over the tables. Waiters moved with their usual rhythm. Glasses chimed. When Dean walked out under the lights, there was a pause, just long enough for recognition to deepen into something else. Then the applause came, steadier than before, lasting a few seconds longer than habit demanded. He didn't acknowledge it. No bow held too long. No knowing smile. He adjusted the microphone, glanced at the band, and began as if nothing outside the room had ever mattered. That restraint carried its own message. He wasn't asking to be vindicated. He was reminding the audience why he had never needed defending. Backstage afterward, the talk was practical: schedules, travel, timing. Nobody brought up the questions from New York. A few people watched him more carefully than they used to, not searching for cracks, but for confirmation. What they found was consistency. The same measured pace, the same refusal to decorate his life with explanations. The journalist who had started it all didn't disappear. He continued working, continued asking questions, but something about his reputation had shifted. He was no longer described as fearless. He was described as aggressive. The distinction mattered. It followed him quietly, the way labels do when they've been earned without fanfare. Among those who moved in quieter circles, a phrase began to circulate. Not in print, never on air, but in hallways and private rooms. He didn't deny it. He didn't explain it. He stood above it. The words carried weight because they weren't official. They weren't polished. They survived precisely because no one tried to turn them into a slogan. Dean never corrected the myth as it formed. He understood how legends worked. They didn't belong to the man at the center of them. They belonged to the people who needed an example that didn't shout. Nothing about the era became cleaner. The country didn't stop flirting with fear. Power remained selective in who it protected and who it tested. But one lesson lingered in the industry like a low note that kept vibrating after the music stopped. There were moments when silence was not surrender. Moments when refusing to perform guilt was the most defiant act available. Dean Martin lived with that understanding without turning it into a speech. Years later, when younger performers asked him how to survive pressure, he didn't tell them what to say. He told them when not to speak. The advice sounded almost casual, but it carried the weight of experience. Because in the end, his reputation hadn't been saved by evidence or outrage or public sympathy. It had been preserved by something rarer and far less dramatic: control. And in a world addicted to spectacle, that restraint became his quiet signature, the reason the storm passed without ever truly touching him.